from Lakeview Aquatic Consultants. Welcome back, or welcome if you are new here. Each week I record a YouTube live discussing our weekly Pool Aid newsletter. Today is Wednesday, December 31st of 2025, and I'm going to be talking about the top news stories from the year. This has been such an incredible year for our industry. There have been lots of amazing things that happened. There's also been lots of challenging things that happened. So when I wanted to create a year in review recap, I knew I wanted to go back and try and pull some of those threads together and see what stories really stood the test of time, as well as which stories were harbingers of the year ahead. So let's get started by looking at the Year in Review newsletter. I'm going to link to it down in the description box below. So the format of this newsletter is I basically went back and I reviewed all of our newsletters each week of each month. And so typically there was 3 to 5 newsletters for each month. And obviously I didn't want to create one big list of every single article from every single month. But it definitely became apparent to me as I was going back and looking at the past year, there were some obvious trends and some obvious spikes in terms of what we saw people interested and talking about in the aquatic industry. So right away in our January 10th newsletter, I had a tip of spear, so to speak, of what the year ahead held by talking about Nordic spas. So I shared an article that was talking about the growth of what was then described as Nordic spas. I think as an industry, or at least myself as a consultant, I've become more general in identifying Nordic spas versus cold plunge versus contrast therapy, different types of cold and hot facilities. But that is basically, if I had to pick one theme for 2025, at least in my work life, it was definitely contrast therapy, cold plunge, and Nordic spas. And it's funny that I had this article very much at the beginning of January because it came true, 100% came true in terms of the number of projects we were involved in 2025 and what that looks like heading into 2026. I don't want to speak about a bubble or a glut because I'm not an economist and I don't truly know what the market can bear, whether it's in Calgary, Alberta, Western Canada, and beyond. But it does appear that the demand for these types of facilities is insatiable. So it is going to be a wild ride over the next few years to see how this evolves and develops. Further down in the newsletter, I shared the fact that this infrastructure crisis, it, quote, started to develop in February, but those of us who've been working in aquatics and recreation, we know this infrastructure crisis has been coming for a long time, whether it is in Canada, the US, around the world. We historically saw a lot of legacy infrastructure projects, whether it was bridges or roadways or rec centers. At least in Canada, there was a huge spike in infrastructure development in the 1960s, in part with Canada's centennial in 1967. The same way you might speak in the United States to Eisenhower, Roosevelt after the Great Depression, getting people back to work. You know, there are periods in our history of great growth of infrastructure. And then now we're definitely seeing in, 2020 and beyond up to now 2025, 2026, an infrastructure collapse, unfortunately. I have seen so many projects, so many communities, so many facilities in the last few years who are in that critical stasis where they can't afford to expand or renovate, they can't afford to build, but they also can't afford to do nothing because with the strong US dollar, with the trade and tariff wars this year, in terms of increases in supply chain and product costs, there is no longer, for example, a $15 million Canadian pool. Everything now is 25, 35, 40 million, and prices are just going to go up over the next few years. So February was not any different, I would say, from January 2025 or even back in 2024, but the drumbeat of that infrastructure crisis has very much gotten louder and louder and louder in 2025. And I think it was only drowned out at times by the trade wars and other things like that. In February, there was also a bit of a disagreement between Lifesaving UK and Lifesaving Australia. I thought it was really interesting that Lifesaving Australia came out against alcohol advertising, which I definitely understand and support their point as a charity. But I really wonder behind the scenes what precipitated this very public statement. It was winter for us in the Northern Hemisphere, but summer in Australia in the Southern Hemisphere. And one of the things as a life saving society leadership volunteer, a member, a longtime certified lifeguard, and instructor, at least in Canada, we're always told not to speak negatively about the Life Saving Society in public, to bring any to bring any concerns to them directly and not just air them publicly. So I do kind of wonder behind the scenes what was happening between Life Saving Australia and Life Saving UK that they came out so forcefully. I would hope that they addressed it internally, directly, personally before this big PR blitz, but that was definitely a message that I agree needed to be said when we look at the incidents of drowning related injuries and fatalities, especially amongst young men who might have been drinking. And I see this all the time as a consultant and a micro influencer in my niche on Instagram. People are willing to take very little money to sell themselves out for a brand or a cause that they haven't necessarily researched. And I don't say that that necessarily happened for Royal Lifesaving UK. I'm sure they did adequate diligence in terms of thinking about this partnership last year during the Paris Olympics between Tom Daley, the diver, and Malibu Rum. It was very, very cheeky. It was very effective, but the broader questions from members, the board, may have precipitated some after action review, so to speak. Back in February, Acadia University, which is a small university in the Maritimes of Canada, Wolfville, Nova Scotia, they announced the permanent closure of their pool. And this was on the heels of other issues we've seen over the last couple of years. The struggle in Canada, academia, there's been big conversations in 2025 as we saw restrictions on international students. We saw budget crunches at places like Queen's University in Ontario, University of Alberta in Edmonton. They recently cut their swim teams. There was issues back with Laurentian University in Thunder Bay. There have been conversations in schools in British Columbia. I mean, universities are not exempt from this infrastructure crisis. It's something that I'm definitely watching. Back in March, we had more discussion of the infrastructure crisis in terms of sharing additional articles, stories from communities all over North America. I also had a focused newsletter on the Stargard Elite camp session I attended with Paul Snobelin back in January. I took the time to put together my thoughts. He wasn't available for an interview, which is what I had really hoped, but essentially talking about how the algorithm and the programming of pre-2014 AEDs, like automated external defibrillators, I had no idea as a first aid instructor or first aid instructor trainer that there was a finite shelf life on AEDs. I am sure that there are communities out there that have had AEDs in those boxes in the hallways, by the library, in public areas for decades, literally. And I personally was not aware of the limitations. Like, certainly science is always developing. There's changes in delivering CPR shocks and primary care, but I hadn't realized to the extent that that would trickle down to AEDs. I'm not a specialist. And so that was a very important newsletter that I shared pertaining to making sure facilities or organizations are looking at their AEDs, because there can be a tendency in organizations like, don't give things away, don't get rid of things, we can't afford to replace them. But there are going to be pieces of equipment, no different from other safety areas or workplace requirements, where we can't just keep using the same thing in perpetuity just because it looks okay. It won't work necessarily when we need it to. Also in March, we had a triathlete who drowned fatally at a high-profile open water swim event. If you've been here before, you know we've done some different conversations with Dr. Katie Cleesby. She did her PhD on lifeguarding at open water events. She consults on open water events. She is a Ironman athlete herself, triathlete. She has a passion for water safety and these endurance sports, but there's often a conflict historically with the organizers of these events not necessarily wanting to properly assess all aspects of a rescue plan because it may not be in line with their vision or their budget for these types of events. Not suggesting that's what happened here, but it will be one of the news stories I continue to track. Similarly, I've shared my desire to track workplace drowning fatalities. It's just a personal interest that I have that we should be investigating as water safety professionals, that drowning fatalities don't only happen in a pool or in a lake or in the ocean. I also talked in March about the Oceana fire in terms of the analysis being done by the government, looking at who they thought was responsible for that fatality, because there was an individual working at the site who did die when that construction project caught fire. April was the start of the Vancouver Parks Board saga regarding the new pool being built in Vancouver. Throughout this year, you couldn't miss it. Almost every week, there was some sort of update in terms of petitioning the Parks Board, complaints to media, sit ins, public debate about whether Vancouver should have a 25 or a 50-meter pool. This is a debate as old as time. You saw the same thing most recently in Regina, Saskatchewan, with the redevelopment of the Wascana outdoor pool project during the pandemic. There's been similar conversations throughout Ontario. There is lots of reasons to have a 50-meter pool, bringing in competition, bringing in certain types of activities and events, revenue. But there's also certain reasons not to have a 50-meter pool in terms of the depth and accessibility and needs of the community. In April, I shared Jonathan Keller. He is the co-founder and CEO of LifeFloor, the safety flooring out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. I shared a post that he had put up on LinkedIn and gave me permission to reshare regarding what it means to be made in America and the decision making that goes into something like that. There are a few legacy brands in aquatics that are still made in America, if that is something that you consider important to you. So, for example, you have Aquatic out of Montana, you have Taylor Technologies, the water testing chemicals out of Sparks, Maryland. I should clarify that Aquatic, they make accessibility products and lifts. Here in Canada, you have a brand like Aquam that they make the Ava foam out of Quebec. Right, there are reasons that people buy in domestically. Water safety products, for example, they also make a lot of their products in the USA. So for some people, that's very important. Here in Canada, over the last year, 2025, we've had that big conversation, elbows up, Canadian nationalism, marking in the grocery store which products are made, assembled, produced in Canada. But that's not a focus for everyone necessarily. Certainly now, even as we hit the end of 2025, it's interesting to see how much some industries or people have pulled back on that, and some industries or people have doubled down on sourcing domestically, buying domestically, not shopping from certain providers or not traveling to certain countries. I don't like to promote ads or products, but the ad in April released by Apple Technology regarding a ocean water rescue that was completed in Australia from a man who was caught in a riptide, rip current, pulled out into the ocean from his Apple Watch is pretty compelling, to the degree that hopefully that story is accurate. And then there was also some discussion in April. There was a big uproar in Paris regarding the safety of women in public change rooms, in pools. And respectfully, I think this is a part of a larger conversation about being female and living as a female in France, because this came on the heels of the terrible sexual assault case that was happening in the south of France, and the movement that prompts a lot more conversation this past year regarding women's rights and women's situations throughout France. So I think that the two are connected, but really, really awful case. Forgive me, I don't remember the city or the woman's name, but a really momentous case in France earlier in 2025. Heading on into May of 2025, there was a variety of stories. The big one that dominated the news cycle May into the summer and even the fall is the non-fatal drowning of Trig Kieser, Emily Kieser, the TikTok influencer out of Arizona. Her son, who allegedly drowned in the backyard pool while she was out to dinner. Her husband was meant to be watching the children, the baby and the 3-year-old. He allegedly placed a sports bet on his phone, and her son was drowning, according to surveillance footage that has been blocked from being released, for at least 7 to 8 minutes. He was taken off of life support and he died in hospital. All of this has trickled out over the last couple of months. And I've been very hesitant to cover this story too much because, on the one hand, an individual deserves her right to privacy. On the other hand, detractors have said routinely this woman financially incentivized sharing her family online to work with brands, to be an influencer. And so striking that balance where this is a really important topic of conversation in society over the last 6 months. And I don't want to make light of a family's tragedy, except that it is an important conversation that the problem in the room is that she did not have a pool fence. She did not have layers of protection. And allegedly the pool cover, which was not on at the time of the incident, and then the number of social media videos previously alleging where she was not as cautious around the pool, has prompted really significant conversations that I think aquatic professionals need to be aware of should they choose to participate in them locally or in your communities or workplaces. I also shared in May an interview with Alex Ojeda, the water park influencer. He is such a wonderful guy, and I do recommend following his content if you have any interest in extreme tourism, water slides, water parks, cruising. His stuff is amazing. He is a brand ambassador for Royal Caribbean, and just his footage and the way he films his content feels very, I hate to say it, genuine, and like you really feel like you're participating with him in a lot of these activities that he's doing. Speaking of Royal Caribbean, in June, Royal Caribbean announced a bunch of new projects actually in 2025, but the first one coming down the pipe was a flagship water park in Costa Maya, Mexico, which is going to follow a similar pattern to Coco Cay in the Bahamas. Now, detractors of international development by corporations in poorer countries have rightly said, is this a fair deal for the Mexican region where this is located? Is this Royal Caribbean scooping up a bunch of land so they can keep all the money for themselves from their cruise guests on shore and not patronize local tour operators, local shops and businesses? Absolutely, yes. But two things can be true at the same time. You can have questions about the ethics and morality of this handshake agreement, but then also be excited by the design renderings for this type of water park that is going to be designed by Martin Aquatic, one of Royal Caribbean's longtime partners. Alex Ojeda mentioned that he did some consulting on this project. It's going to have one of the largest or longest, I think longest lazy rivers in the world. It's going to be a venue, respectfully, that is available in Costa Maya, which is not a hugely developed cruise port. There's not a lot there. So it is a real appeal for those of us cruisers who've been to that port and who feel like they might have exhausted everything that there is to do there. So I am following this project because I'm genuinely curious to see, it's whether you believe in cruising or not, the amenities and the properties that are being developed by Royal Caribbean in places like now they're doing the Royal Beach Club in Nassau, Bahamas. There is going to be La Lipa Beach Club at another location in Mexico. There is a beach club being developed somewhere in Oceania. I can't remember if it was Vanuatu, somewhere like that. And then a beach club in Greece as well. So whether you believe that these are good ideas or not, the actual presence of this aquatic facility is going to have an impact on the industry and the design decisions that are being made there. I shared in June a non-fatal entrapment that occurred in Mallorca in Spain, as well as a change in licensure where Australian lifeguards will finally have an easier pathway to transition to being lifeguards here in Canada under the Life Saving Society National Lifeguard Standard. This is something that has been needed for such a long time. I worked with a client for a number of years who would hire lifeguards from England, from Australia, both Royal Life Saving Society Commonwealth countries, and we would have to completely retrain them each summer because they could not easily transition their qualifications from those countries to Canada. I understand why these rules exist, but it's not making it any easier when you have well qualified individuals who could certainly do a bridging program, a transition program, but to completely retrain from scratch 60 to 100 hours, I've sometimes questioned that myself. Moving on to the July portion of the year in our newsletter, there is only one story that deserves any presence for July, and that is the drowning fatalities at Camp Mystic in Texas. What a terrible, terrible tragedy. And we have not even fully started to understand all aspects of what precipitated this. There has been incredible respect towards the families, the campers, the tragedies. However, there is only very much starting to also be analysis and investigation about what happened. An example of that would be a news link that I shared from a few weeks ago regarding the 911 calls. I hadn't realized myself, and I would consider myself fairly well read on this topic, the number of other near misses, near incidents that also happened at the same time at adjacent summer camps. And I am a former camper myself, camp counselor myself from a remote, rural overnight camp. I understand some of the conversations about cost and what's reasonable. And these properties are only used 2 to 3 months per year. They're often nonprofits or they're often, small held family businesses. It's a very thorny situation, but first and foremost, 29 people drowned in flash flooding, and there needs to be a real conversation about that, and it hasn't happened yet. I think it's appropriate that it hasn't happened yet. We do need to honor the victims and the families, but going into 2026 and beyond, there is no question in my mind that there are going to be safety standards and procedural decisions that aquatic facilities, summer camps, recreation groups are going to adopt as we learn more about what happened. I think this is also going to be muddied for years by litigation. We may not get the full picture, but there is a lot to consider from this terrible, terrible incident. And that is my only story worth mentioning in July. In August, I talked about the information I got from a ratepayer in Cochrane who shared some of the difficulties that the community had allegedly through a secret outsourcing of operations of the Spray Lakes Sawmills Spray Lakes Sawmills Family Sports Center, SLS Center, as well as the Jamin Aquatic Center. There was an attempt to have the YMCA of Alberta take over operations of the facility to, quote, save money. And there was a lot of things that didn't make sense about this proposal that I dug into in one of our first few newsletters of August 2025. Royal Caribbean also had a bad several weeks with a number of injuries and fights that were definitely in not just the cruise media, like those people who follow cruise message boards or cruising information, but in the general media. So there was an incident where a man nearly fell over the edge off of the infinity pool on Icon of the Seas. There was a crack to one of the suspended water slides on Icon of the Seas where the man going down the slide was badly cut and thankfully did not fall out onto the pool deck, a depth of 20, 30 feet. There was a number of fights at Royal Caribbean's Coco Cay Beach Club. There were some incidents. It just was not a good month for Royal Caribbean. Idaho brought back pool inspections in the state after several months ago. They stopped doing them as of July 1st. The allegation was that this was stuffed into a bigger bill. People didn't understand what they were voting on, but they did bring them back after a period where the state of Idaho canceled basically all state pool inspections. And we also started to hear a lot of press about this Plus Pool project that has been talked about in New York City for years, literally years. I've been reading press releases about it, but now we've started to see press releases about the construction of the structure. Stay tuned for 2026 if it actually gets launched into the Hudson River. Moving on to September, we moved our newsletter to Wednesdays, and truly I moved it to Wednesdays because I like to take half days on Friday. I work definitely more than 40 hours a week, and so when I have a Friday where it's kind of quiet by lunch, especially because our Eastern clients, right, Eastern time zone, Atlantic time zone, that starts to really taper off by 11, 12 o'clock in Mountain. I just want my afternoons to take a nap or go to the gym. So I moved the newsletter to Wednesday. That's the only reason. Also, I'm sure it makes it easier for people to read midweek as opposed to having this big, bulky newsletter in front of you before the weekend. That was the right decision. I know a few people have said, oh, well, you moved it to Wednesday because of X newsletter that's also sent on Wednesday. No, that's not why I moved it. I moved it because I prefer half day Fridays, and Monday, I don't want to start off the week with a newsletter. Tuesdays, there's too much news still to come out. Thursdays, lots of people don't work. So Wednesday it is. And there's never any specific time. As those of you know, it's released when it's released. Sometimes I happen to be up at 5 and get it done by 8. Other times you'll be lucky to get it in the evening. The big thing in September for me was the city of Dallas, Texas, announcing very quietly that they are permanently closing 9 outdoor pools. I still don't know how there's not more public furor about this or backlash, or maybe there's context locally in Dallas, Fort Worth that we don't have internationally, but this just prompts so many questions for me. Also in September, I talked about the lack of representation in the posted schedule for an upcoming surf park industry event. And I talked about this off the record with a few people at the shows, like the World Water Park Association show in October, IAPA Expo in November. There were lots of people who had opinions about this, but people are very reticent to say anything because obviously this is a huge growth industry that lots of developers and architects want to continue to be a part of. There's also been throughout the year, not just in September, that's where I mentioned it, but throughout 2025, we saw a growth in violence towards aquatic staff, i.e., lifeguards, especially out of Australia. We saw an actual campaign from Royal Lifesaving Australia regarding these confrontations between customers and lifeguard staff, which is just horrific to see. In my entire 20 plus years in aquatics, we've always had individual confrontations. I had a man block me into my office once. I had a woman throw things at me. It's not saying that violence doesn't exist, but it is a whole new thing now to see the frequency of customer on staff violence. And it's not just at pools, aquatic facilities, it's also at general recreation centers and amusement parks. So I did want to tap that into September because we're still seeing that happening and it doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. October was about our sexual harassment in aquatics survey. I shared a story that I heard from a colleague who wanted to be anonymous regarding a situation in her workplace where there was an allegation of sexual harassment. And I was a bit naive as a Canadian, as an Albertan, as an older millennial. I thought we'd solve this. I've never had this experience with colleagues at work. Certainly, I've had this experience out in public as a woman in the workplace setting with customers, but never in my work team environment. I've always found personally, in my personal experiences, aquatic staff to be amazing, incredible, trustworthy, respectful about the nudity that we have in working in bathing suits. So I did do a survey and the results are going to be out next week. I wanted to give it its appropriate due investigation and analysis. So look for that to be in the newsletter next week, the first week of 2026. Few other articles in the last few months of the year. In November, I talked about how Halloween is the event that you need to be programming for 2026. It is a growth event. Kind of think like how pumpkin spice and the autumnification of business has crept back into September and now August from when 10 years ago, October, fall harvest, August, Harvest Festival was just a couple weeks for some of us in the Northeast in October. Now it's everywhere, pumpkin spice, everything, whether you like it or not. The next thing, in my opinion, is going to be Halloween, based on what I've been seeing reported at the big trade shows and spreading to things like car washes or general amusement parks, placing these special types of programs. It is a huge, huge money draw. Also in November was the first swimming pool wedding I've ever seen. I did not attend it. This was a widely shared news story about an elderly couple who met in aqua fitness class, and they got very water safe kind of wedding outfits, and they got married in the pool, which was really, really cute. And then I also talked about in November the importance of giving ourselves more credit for the amount of work that we do year round to operate aquatic facilities, whether you are seasonal, summer only, or year round. It is a ton of work, and that is not always given its due. December 2025, just a few weeks ago, I've shared about profit versus accessibility, talking about SeaWorld in Orlando and the Americans Disabilities Act inquiry by the Department of Justice. I shared that incredible article from the New York Times regarding this building that's failing on Billionaires Row in New York City. It's not a pool, but there's a lot of lessons learned about how these things can go so wrong when there's so many competing interests on a tight timeline. And I've seen this so much this year in projects, including one I have right now, that I'm just waiting to get it over the finish line because there have been so many delays, respectfully, in my opinion, and I'm being intentionally vague, but so many delays because people cannot agree to move forward with what is right for the client or the facility. Everybody has their own vested interest that they want to protect for their own business reasons, financial reasons, legal reasons, and that stalls out the project from getting open and permitted. Then, as always, I did get to some new articles because we haven't had a newsletter. We skipped last week, Christmas Eve, December 24th. Our last newsletter prior to this was a little bit late, Thursday, December 18th. Before I get to those last few news articles, I did also share our top videos of the year on the YouTube channel by views. If you are listening to this video, if you've made it this far in the live, please do consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. You would not believe it makes a huge difference, truly, in showcasing the importance of what we're trying to do completely for free. Like this video, comment, share it with a friend. All of that really does prove to the algorithm that what we're doing matters. The themes of our most popular videos were definitely lifeguarding and cruising, which I'm going to do what I need to do, but it's a bit odd that that is, our best viewed videos. That's not what I would have thought. In terms of the recent news, I'm just going to do a quick rundown without much commentary. I share an article regarding expected life expectancy for commercial buildings. I love this quote. I would frame it and put it on the wall. Most commercial buildings have a standard design life of around 50 to 60 years, and it's common for them to only last half as long. Shared a news story about a woman who died in the UK after allegedly catching bacteria from a hot tub during a family trip. Shared some changes to Florida's swimming pool swim lesson voucher system. Apologies if the screen was black for a couple minutes there. I didn't toggle out of the right window. Is the International Swim League coming back? That is something that I'm certainly following. We have an interesting article about how the tsunami in Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, 20 years ago, some of you might recall, that has changed water safety in Sri Lanka a generation later. This is an interesting article about how that tragedy has precipitated local education, local classes, really, really interesting outcome. Not a research paper, but just really interesting to see coming out of that tragedy 20 years ago. One story that kind of cropped up over Christmas that I'm watching closely is a woman who allegedly pushed another child underwater at a hotel. She was charged, she was taken to jail, she appeared in court. I really hope we get more information because this is just a strange story where this woman allegedly did this to another child. And I don't know if she snapped, she had a moment of frustration or what, but just a very, very scary incident. There was one earlier this year as well in Texas where it was deemed a hate crime because somebody tried to drown a Muslim girl. I don't recall if she was wearing a swimming hijab or what, but it was a hate crime, which unfortunately is a little bit more clear to me, but just pushing someone else's kid underwater doesn't make sense to me. Like, why would you do that? Another great news story that I shared is that Stargard Elite is going to be working on developing free diving safety standards for pools. This is so necessary. They are also working, credit to Stargard Elite, they're also working on surf lagoon standards. And whether you are a Stargard Elite aficionado or not, one of the reasons that I go on their cruise, I attend their professional development events, I follow what they're doing closely, is I think they are very responsive to areas of our industry that some of the legacy brands and organizations don't want to touch. So, like I mentioned, surf pools are huge and they have been very antagonistic towards the need for lifeguards and water safety. And so, Stargard Elite has said we need to create a standard for safe use, lifeguarding, what that looks like. And now they're doing the same thing with free diving and then deep end fitness, which Dr. Semsrott is also working with. I don't love free diving. I don't love those crazy videos we see on Instagram or Pinterest or YouTube, guys working out underwater with weights, doing lung busters. But I recognize it's out there in our fitness driven industry, right? Remember when CrossFit became big? Now the big thing is it Hydrox or Hyrox, Hydrox test competitions. Like if it's out there, people are doing it. And so we need to address it. No different from Wim Hof or other types of breath holding methods. We can't just stick our heads in the sand and do nothing about it. It's super, super important. And I'm very happy to see that somebody is taking the leadership initiative to discuss ways that we can improve this for swimmer safety. Shared an article out of Australia that I think is also very indicative of a problem that we have across the industry. So experts are warning that Australia's beach warning signs do not clearly convey the message to those who do not speak English as a first language. That should be bolded, highlighted, underlined in red. That is a huge issue all around the world with our transnational communities, right? You might grow up in Morocco, you might move to London, then you might go to school in Pittsburgh, right? You might be living in Calgary, but you fled from Ukraine where you didn't have the same experiences with water or pools. Our world is international, transnational. Our cities are transnational. We need to get away from language being only in English, words instead of pictograms. Everything needs to be updated in our signage, whether you're a hotel, a beach, a water park, a swimming pool. This is very, very basic, but a lot of people are still resisting this for some reason. We had an update on our friends from the Vancouver Parks Board regarding the Vancouver Aquatic Center project, right? We've come full circle from the beginning of the year. I had a couple more sciencey articles regarding CT value, so contact time, and ORP, oxidation reduction potential, out of the certified pool operator course. Some of you might be familiar with those. I also shared a tip somebody sent me regarding on Reddit the permanent closure of Wahoo Swim School in Spruce Grove, Alberta. A lot of you were aware of this project. It was a bunch of sea cans, above ground pools in a commercial space. The growth of swim schools in Canada has been pretty slow, but there is huge demand for swim lessons in private facilities. Too long didn't read. The landlord locked them out in December of 2025, excuse me, a couple of weeks ago. This is ironic because I was actually going to stop and see this facility on my way to Fox Creek for work on December 5th, but it was so cold and so snowy, I ran out of time and didn't. By that point, they were apparently already locked out, but it looks like the landlord is trying to move forward with a new tenant, a new swim school provider to occupy that space. So we will come back to the story when we have more information. It does not appear that the pools are going to be raised and not reopened. There is something percolating there. Shared a couple of other drowning incident stories, as well as a developing story here in Alberta, in Calgary last night. So December 30th, quite late at night, there was another water main break near 16th Avenue, the Trans-Canada and Sarcee Trail. This is a very big deal because we had a large water main break in Calgary in 2024. There was a huge issue with terms of water scarcity, water restrictions, pools were closed, people were told to, limit their showering, and pools couldn't operate. So it is not only an infrastructure concern. As an Albertan, somebody near Calgary, this is in a terrible area near where people transition to drive from Calgary out to Banff and Canmore. People are going to be going out for New Year celebrations, ski holidays, long weekend, but it is also very concerning for water security in that area. Have a client in that area that's been trying to get open for a number of weeks. So they were definitely front of mind when I heard this, as well as the video footage is pretty shocking in terms of the water safety rescue aspect of flash flooding, and people do drown in cars when there is flash flooding. And the videos I shared, they're on Instagram. I will probably include them in an upcoming reaction video as well, just because they're so acute. That's the only way to understand how these drowning fatalities occur, is to experience in live time these sudden incidents. And thank goodness the temperature here has dropped, or sorry, it's gone up. It has been very warm the last couple of days, like 1, 2, 3 degrees Celsius. We've had a Chinook come in. Earlier in the week, it was minus 40. People would have been freezing, hypothermic instantly with this flash flooding in cold water. So thank goodness it is warmer. And so the risk of hypothermia was negated. It was simply a risk of drowning, which is terrible. As always, at the very end of our newsletter, I do share some recent YouTube videos. I've been working very, very hard to get caught up on YouTube. So keep an eye on the channel because I've been pre-scheduling content, both lifeguard, both reaction, both cruise content, travel content. I still haven't done my World Water Park Association vlog, and lots of other things coming to the YouTube channel over the next 6 to 8 weeks. But in the past week, we did release the audio version of the last newsletter. We did release a video pertaining to a safety discussion of cape towels versus burrito toweling your kid after swim lessons. And then I did have a reaction video that, thank you, those of you who've sent comments and shares and likes and watches, very well received, about things not to do as a lifeguard or a pool operator. And I do have lots of other content of that type I'd like to share. So stay tuned. It is still a work in progress. I appreciate those of you who are subscribing to the weekly newsletter. It is a passion project, as well as YouTube, to promote what we are doing as aquatic consultants, helping facilities to run better, which is not saving money. It is saving you time to figure out what is the root cause of a lot of your day-to-day problems. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Thank you for making it to the end. This was a long one, but it is fair because 2025 is a long year. We had, almost 52 newsletters, plus minus a few. But I appreciate those of you who subscribe to the newsletter, who reply to the newsletter, letting me know comments or concerns or corrections. I appreciate those of you who share it with your colleagues and coworkers and promote it internally. It means a lot, and I look forward to continuing to serve you and help you run your pools better in 2026. Thanks so much for being here, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye for now.